Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and I'm very happy to welcome to today's show, dun dun dun, Attorney General Shari. I almost confused your name, so sorry about that. Attorney General Charity Clark and Shari, who is an advocate with the Women's Freedom Center, which is an organization that supports survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, that is commemorating its 50th anniversary. And I tell you, folks, we were talking about cars that spy on you before the show, and I still have this vision of cars in my mind. I apologize, Charity and Shari, for my slight distraction.
Well, there's so many interesting topics. That's, you're a curious person as a journalist, of course. We understand.
Exactly. Well, and the solving many technical problems with sticky notes is quite the thing too. Well, we will be talking, folks, today about some bills that are moving through the State House that have to do with sexual assault, but we'll also be checking in with Shari because the Women's Freedom Center, as I mentioned, is commemorating its 50th anniversary. And so in this framework of what's happening now, we also have this 50-year kind of look back at how things have changed or maybe not for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. So once again, welcome Charity and welcome Shari.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Shari, let's start with you. I know you and your colleagues at the Freedom Center have been really sitting with this 50-year anniversary and what it means. And so I'm curious for you, as an organization, what has the last 50 years taught you? But I'm also curious for you, as someone who's doing the work now, what you're sitting with.
Great, epic question. I would say, first of all, the Women's Freedom Center is not unique, right? Around the country, a lot of the early grassroots feminist organizations like us have been turning 50 or will be soon. And I feel like in our culture, that's always a poignant opportunity to reflect, what does half a century teach us about what survivors are still up against, what we're all still up against, trying to end domestic and sexual violence. And since we say every month is Sexual Violence Awareness Month, since we're just past April, focusing on the topic for today's show around sexual there are so many things we could reflect on, both positive and challenging. I think we all know a lot has certainly happened in these past 50 years that's positive. And, for instance, the Freedom Center began as a local Me Too movement in Brattleboro. So it's a reminder, right? This kind of activism and groundswell to break kind of this vast historic silence has been going on for a while. And so it began in that way. Certainly just breaking that silence was a huge part of progress in our culture. We've seen various uprisings, I would say, of more activism, most recently, of course, Me Too some years ago. But I'd say if we look across sort of 50 years and sort of work for justice, and especially women's causes, it tends to be, like a move towards progress and then backlash. And I think that's what we're really up against, right? Definitely progress has been made for survivors in our culture, but then we typically face, pretty often surprising levels of backlash too. And that's how the pendulum kind of keeps going. It's like anything, right? So it's some mix of vision and then revision and continuing on. So that's kind of a snapshot at 50 years, I would say. And we can dig more into it, but yeah, I'll pause there.
Well, how about for you, Shari, as someone who's doing the work, what do these 50 years mean?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate like that deeper dive. First of all, I feel so much respect and gratitude for the foremothers, mostly, it was certainly all genders, but mostly women that even got us here, right? Because I think, again, to remember 50 some years ago, it was revolutionary even to name the problem, even to say that either that someone had been sexually assaulted by, the myth was that it was the stranger in the bushes. Overwhelmingly, what those early advocates found out and had to teach themselves to address was that most of the calls they were getting, even though it was called a rape crisis center, was from people being harmed, including raped by their intimate partner. So the learning curve, my sense was like straight up, right? Like everything was new. We certainly now have an amazing groundwork that we can, base our work on going forward, but we owe so much to, the people that came before us. And I think the other piece that I love to see now in terms of changes in the culture is it's not just that there are more programs and supports for survivors, hooray for that, but naturally in the culture now too, there are more people supporting survivors just organically in their own lives because the culture has shifted. More people understand a little bit more. I mean, that's saying that it's always great or that people always, it's never been easy to come forward as a survivor of sexual violence. It's still not easy now, but we do see more solidarity. We do see more people who get it. And so that gives me hope. Yeah, and I'll let you all jump in there too.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So, Charity, I was listening to your you gave some recent testimony to the Senate Education Committee for one of the bills we're about to talk about. And you had said something along the lines, as one of the first women to run for Attorney General in Vermont, you understood what it was like to walk across a dark parking lot with your keys in your hand, which I think is a scenario a lot of women relate to. So, aside from the bills that we'll be talking about, what are you sitting with as someone who, you have this job of overseeing the legal structure in Vermont and court cases and people's rights and freedoms. Um, but I'm sure you can't separate that from also being a woman and what that means for safety for women in Vermont. I'd love to hear any thoughts on that.
I ran in part because we had never had a woman elected attorney general here in Vermont. And so when I was elected by Vermonters, in a landslide, I took that as my charge to always be looking for opportunities to issue spot areas that maybe were overlooked or hadn't been given their due because there wasn't a woman who had the same lens that I had. The line that you referenced about the parking lot and the keys, I developed that as part of my stump speech. And it really was my kickoff speech. But what I found is that it resonated with women and men because women knew exactly what I was talking about. And a lot of men didn't. I didn't realize. And even I was quoted because of that testimony in my local paper. And a woman I know in town, because we volunteer together on a board, said to me, her husband was like, I don't get the key reference. And I was like, that's the point, that men aren't getting the key reference. And it just really underscores that I always need to be continuing to be looking for these opportunities to make sure that a woman's perspective is heard in that way. And that bill is one where it was important to me that I testify and just provide that perspective, I think, as a woman leader here in Vermont. And really all of us should be thinking about that, which I think is part of what happened after Me Too. Me Too normalized the speaking out of these violent acts against women that ran the gamut. I mean, some people said Me Too on their social media, and they had never been sexually assaulted in the way that we think of it, but they might have endured some other behavior that they wouldn't have had they been a man or had the culture been different. And so I'm always thinking about that in my role, but I really encourage everyone to be thinking about opportunities to see things through their own lens and name these things that we see because we have this unique perspective as women.
Thank you, Charity. Well, let's segue to the bills that we'll be talking about today. If you don't mind, can we start with S120 with the education? Thank you.
Sure.
So just for folks in Windham County to let you know that one of our senators, Nader Hashim, serves on this committee, and it's S120. and it's around campus violence. Talk to me about that a little bit, Charity.
Well, this bill came from a working group, study committee. I can't remember if it was 2021. I think it was 2021 when that was established. So it was, in Vermont, those work really well. It's just a group of stakeholders who are assigned to get together and look at an issue and come up with recommendations to the legislature or others on how things could be improved. And so this bill was, an outcome of that working group. And we had a seat at that during that working group, and a lot of people did. And when you look at the bill, it really is in some ways just codifying best practices and representing I don't want to say agreement, but there really was agreement among the stakeholders who worked together on what this might look like that could, a lot of this is about reporting and prevention. And I think, training and providing awareness is baked into this, and providing opportunities for training and support for training, and also working with the various members of the network against domestic and sexual violence here in Vermont. And the Women's Freedom Center is a part of that work. And so, collaborating with all of the many incredible lessons over the decades that these organizations here in Vermont have learned, and sharing that with all the other different stakeholders who have their own perspectives, and then coming up with a bill that, frankly, this is something that's done pretty regularly in Montpelier, which is wonderful. And this is just an example of that. So if you read the bill, it's succinct. It's an outcome of a lot of work that's been put in by a variety of stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about campus violence, could you give us a snapshot of how this concern of all concerns came to the top of the pile, for lack of a better term?
From my perspective, when there were protests at UVM in, I think it was 2021, it could have been 2022, but I'm pretty sure it was 2021. I remember as a UVM graduate, and also as a person who worked on campus for several years, because that's where our consumer assistance program is located, it really hit home, and realizing that regardless of what UVM was doing and felt they were doing, clearly the students did not feel heard. And one of the things that's so great is the legislature heard, and they created a working group, and then this bill was drafted. And I think it's really important, and you see this theme, Shari had talked about this theme of making sure that silence is not where we are, because that was yesteryear, and we've moved on from that. And now is a time when we should encourage people to be brave and speak out. And so it's really wonderful that people were brave and they spoke out, and then there actually has been movement by policymakers in trying to address the problem. So that's always great to see.
Thank you. Shari, in your experience at the Freedom Center, I know Windham County doesn't have a lot of colleges in its region compared to, say, as big as, say, UVM. But I'm wondering, what do you see as far as campus violence goes, to violence towards students?
Well, I
didn't get that. Could you try again?
I'm sorry, Siri keeps thinking I'm talking to her when I'm talking to you, Shari.
You need to refer to our data privacy podcast that we did.
The names sound alike too, so I'm sure that's a bit confusing. We certainly do have some college campuses that we work with. And just for folks, let me just for a second say, for folks maybe aren't as familiar, first of all, the Women's Freedom Center supports survivors of all genders. We know sexual violence can happen to all genders. And we do our outreach and education across the lifespan. So we are in schools for, as young as the schools will bring us in, to have some age appropriate conversations about these issues. And then again, all the way up to, it's lifelong conversation. So in terms of sort of what we're seeing, I love the fact that we have this broad span here, looking at the legislative angle, like how does the culture kind of fine tune and turn the dial and get things careful enough that they actually are addressing the need. In our work, at our end of things, we look at the mix of sort of learning and unlearning that needs to happen in the culture. right? And I'd say the most challenging thing around rape culture is the unlearning that still needs to happen. But the learning part, going in with young people every few years, I wouldn't say even every generation, but every few years, they, are savvier in our culture because they too are exposed to the media, the conversations. They can give you often some sense of what we mean by rape culture. Again, that wasn't always the case, and so that's kind of our work, is asking these questions and bringing conversation, like, why does our culture still struggle with consent and unwanted sexual behavior? We need to get in there as early as we possibly can to at least try to stop it from happening. And then at the other end, the legislative end, what can we do when it's already happened? And how can we support institutions who historically have often failed the brave survivors coming forward? What can we do to mandate that there be more just the quality of attention to when somebody does come forward, what can happen from there? So I feel like we're at two ends of very much the same sort of spectrum of work here.
And Charity, you talked about S120 kind of codifying some of the best practices for college campuses for when people do come forward to talk about rape or sexual assault. Can you give us some highlights of what some of those best practices are?
Well, for me, the thing that really resonated was making sure that people who are trained, like Shari and her teammates, are involved, and there's a partnership between the school and the local, whatever the local nonprofit would be in the area to provide that support. Obviously, sexual assault is such a complicated experience for the victim. I want to recommend a book. I'm a big reader, and I read Chantel Miller, is that her name? Now I've forgotten what it is. She was the victim in the Brock Turner case.
Mm-hmm.
He sexually assaulted her behind a dumpster on a college campus in California. Is it?
Well, you're talking. I'll look it up while you're talking.
First of all, what an incredible person, but it's also, she's quite a writer. It's such a good book, and I think it does such a good job of really explaining, or that's not explain, it shows what it might be like to be a victim, what the victim goes through, and I'm saying victim because I think about the prosecutor and that dynamic. Her case went on for years, and how hard that was, and all of it. It's such a moving book. So I recommend that for listeners who are interested in learning more about that perspective. I really took a lot away from that book. That year I read it, it was like the year it came out, it was probably the best book I read. I loved it. It was so well done.
So for listeners, I just looked it up and I'll link to it in the show notes. It's called Know My Name, a memoir by Chantel Miller.
I did eventually get the name right. It just took me a couple of processing. So good. Yeah.
Yeah, I have to agree with Charity. It is powerful, it's profound, and it manages to just it just hits such nerves of truth that often in rape culture get blurred over, right? Yep. And I would say, we know this, but throughout history, the sexual and gender-based crimes have always been treated unlike any other crimes in patriarchy, right? I mean, just imagine even if we could just sort of ditch the endless scrutiny that the victim gets of everything they did or wore, and instead, like with every other crime, just scrutinize what the offender did and wore, so we could actually go find them and hold them accountable. Like if we zoom back to like right out of the gate, these crimes are treated very differently, and the shaming and blaming, it's quite remarkable, actually, one, that survivors come forward in the culture still as it is, right? Hooray for those who do. And for the Freedom Center, we support survivors in whatever way they want to handle their healing journey. But, thank you to those brave ones who make such a lasting mark on the culture, and this book absolutely did. And then the other end of it, the fact that people do manage to heal in a culture that's still so unhealthy itself, that's amazing too, right? It all goes to the resilience of survivors, I would say. And I love that you brought that book up because lasting impact.
Yep.
So I'd like to take a little detour there and really highlight what you just said, Shari, about how many of these sexually based crimes, assault, rape, um, are treated differently than other crimes. And you mentioned, I think a lot of us hear that well, what were you wearing? Question that victims tend to get. But I think it would be really good to just, if we can, zero in on some of the other ways these crimes are treated differently. Because I think a lot of people wouldn't think of it that way.
And Charity, I'll welcome you to jump in as well on any of this. But, you know, I would, and you even referenced like in the Brock Turner situation, or so many of the horrific headlines in recent years, Steubenville, et cetera. There's very often a knee-jerk response in the culture when someone comes forward to think, oh, these poor boys, or oh, these poor promising young male students, what's going to happen to their bright future? I mean, countless times, so many iterations of that happening. And it's lost that sexual violence is a pretty horrific, traumatic crime. And the lasting potential impact it can leave on the survivor. And that kind of compassion for, you know, what might happen to that survivor has kind of been, you know, silenced in our culture. The response very often is that the insult to the community is that someone dared out the offender, right? And I'm painting with broad strokes here, of course. There's so many variations, but I would say over the past 50 plus years, and certainly way before that as well, right? We know patriarchy is, however far we want to go back there, right? And movements to really address this are now, you know, 50, et cetera. So we still have a lot of work to do, but that theme holds true. I would say some of the responses, just that knee-jerk reaction to question whether it's even true or not, you know, and what did you do, as if any behavior that someone could do or any outfit suddenly makes them rapeable, or suddenly would make an otherwise law-abiding person go down the, like, it doesn't happen like that. But this, every time we take our eye off where the blame belongs, the culture just shifts away from making any progress, right? So our work is always to, first of all, try to uproot the victim blaming and really spotlight who's at fault. It's a chosen behavior, right? It's usually pre-planned, premeditated, and that's what we need to take a look at. Is like, how do we interrupt somebody sort of positioning themselves to commit a crime like that? And that's a bigger conversation, but I'd love for you both to be able to weigh in here.
Well, I was just going to point out, since we're commemorating the 50th anniversary, that in the 70s is when the crime of sexual assault became a crime that could happen between married couples, because until then you couldn't rape your wife. And the reason, of course, is that this crime, which can be so horrific, is also the very same act or similar act can be beautiful and necessary for our procreation on planet Earth. And so I think that that's another difference about this particular crime. And layering onto that, so often there are no witnesses. In the Brock Turner example, there were witnesses because it was public. But there often are no witnesses. And so it adds this layer of complexity to proving the crime, and also burden on the survivor for, you know, reporting. You know, it wasn't like everyone saw what happened and that changes their experience with what happened. It's really on them. They're the ones who saw what happened, and the perpetrator. So I think it really is a unique crime for many reasons, but I wanted to flag that one, how much we have progressed since the 70s.
Thank you. Thank both of you. So I know there's another bill we want to talk about, but I think we need to wait for the second half because we have just about 5 minutes before the end of this first half. What do we want to leave listeners with right now? Anything you want to tie up or mention?
I feel compelled to just mention, for folks who are listening to this, whether or not you are, you know, an ally or have a friend who might have gone through this, or you yourself have gone through this, I want to give a little testimonial. organizations like the Women's Freedom Center and others, which there's one in every county, basically there's one in every community, and they are compassionate, incredibly wise and knowledgeable and really dedicated to this issue. And if you have a concern, or if you have a friend with a concern, you can go to the website for the Network Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. It might be sexual and domestic violence. I'm not sure which is first, but you can go to their website and then find the network affiliate in your area. And I would just encourage people to pick up the phone, go to the website, and reach out if you have a concern or a friend with a concern and you want to talk to someone.
Thank you, Charity. Shari, anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely. Agree with that. And there's help available 24/7. There's support. Nobody needs to go through this alone. And if you happen to be in Windham or Southern Windsor County, our 24/7 hotline is 802-254-6954. You're super welcome to reach out.
And I'll link to both the network and the Freedom Center in the show notes of this podcast. Quickly, Shari, before we end, I think this is a concept worth mentioning. We're talking about the struggles right now and the existence, the persistent existence of sexual violence. And yet the Women's Freedom Center, 10 years ago now, maybe, actually changed its name from I think it was the Crisis Center to the Freedom Center, because of some shifts in your own thinking that I think were pretty profound. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Not at all. And thanks for asking that. And I'd say, it goes back to those original foremothers who realized, that language has power, and that what we call something can help determine how we think about it. And I think initially they had to sort of wake the culture up that these aren't just personal, private things that were happening to people behind closed doors. It was actually a community issue, and calling what was happening to women, whether domestic or sexual violence, a crisis, and creating a crisis center was part of that initial galvanizing, right? And I think I think maybe, I don't remember either. I think it was maybe 12, 13 years ago or so that we changed the name. Part of the work there was not having the culture sort of maybe plateau and feel like, there's maybe always going to be a women's crisis center, and have crisis read as kind of stasis, as if there's nothing we can do about it. And again, language has power, and we felt that we really needed to wake that activist language back up, because what, survivors, again, of all genders are looking for is not just the absence of crisis. That's not a lot. It's actual freedom. What would it look like to live in a body, in a world where we are safe, where we are respected, where we can thrive, and no one feels that they have an excuse or an entitlement to harm or access someone else's body, and full stop, right? And so freedom really was part of the continuation of the same activism, and that word seemed to kind of say what we needed it to say.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Attorney General Charity Clark. Shari, who is an advocate with the Women's Freedom Center in Windham County. Stay tuned, folks. The Montpelier Happy Hour will return on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro in a moment. Hello, welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you're just joining us, I'm your host and producer of the show, and I want to quickly do some thank you notes before we dive back into our conversation with the Attorney General Charity Clark and Shari, who is an advocate with the Women's Freedom Center here in Windham County. So the housekeeping is, hey, BCTV, thank you so much for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with PEG stations around Vermont. As well as, if anyone's watching the video version and you're wondering who Amelia Vath is, if you see her square on the Zoom recording, she is the outreach and communications coordinator for Charity's office, and she's just hanging out with us today, making sure we don't get too far off track, maybe.
No, really.
So, Amelia, thank you for being here. But don't be surprised, everyone, if you don't hear her chime into the conversation. And the views and opinions of everyone on the happy hour belong to the hosts and the guests, and not their houseplants, not the platform any of these videos or audios appear on, not their pets, not their bosses, not anybody but us. So you have been warned. And then finally, because Charity, of all our guests, is the one who is the premier cocktail designer. Folks, if you hang around after the show, we're going to do just a little special cocktail designing. And so you can find that as a little bonus over on our Captivate page, which is the Montpelier Happy Hour at captivate.fm. Sorry, I said that wrong. The Montpelier Happy Hour .captivate.fm. So you can check out what cocktails we design to bring down the patriarchy over there.
Cheers to that.
So, Charity, before the break, we were talking about Bill S-120 that I believe is still working its way through the State House. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. And that has to do with codifying some of the best practices around sexual violence on college campuses. But we want to talk about another amendment to the bill, I guess we would say. It's part of the miscellaneous judiciary bill, and that is about revenge porn. And which I have to say is a concept that just blows my mind. I cannot imagine how badly you want to hurt someone if you are going to resort to revenge porn. So tell us a little bit about this, Charity. We have some statutes in place around revenge porn, but this goes a little step further.
That's right. So this makes it clear that it is illegal to make a non-consensual deep fake pornography of someone. So that is, it's a small amendment, just a few words to the revenge porn statute that already exists. And it makes it clear that this new technology that we can use, the AI technology to make deep fakes, cannot be used for non-consensual deep fake pornography. That would be a crime. So we had proposed this. The language is actually based on language that has already been adopted in New York State. And it's right now attached to the miscellaneous judiciary bill, like you said, and that's working its way through the legislature. So we're very hopeful that that will make progress so that it makes it across the finish line in the next week, and the governor hopefully will sign it. As you know, I am a data privacy expert and advocate. And so this issue is really important when you look at deep fakes. And I'll just, for listeners who aren't familiar with deep fakes, a deep fake is when someone takes your face, audio, your voice, or video and makes it look like you're doing something you're not, using technology. And the classic example that might be familiar and is recently in our memories is in our neighboring state of New Hampshire. And for those who are in Windham County, that's even closer than it is for us here in Montpelier. There was a deep fake made of President Biden's voice telling people to do something in the New Hampshire primary. And that was not really him. That was a deep fake. But it turns out that the overwhelming majority of deep fakes are not used for political purposes. They're used in this horrible way. It's non-consensual deep fake pornography. Over 90% of deep fakes being created are pornography. And over 90% of those deep fake pornographies use whose face? Women's faces. And so this is a very gendered crime. I'm really grateful that the legislature and frankly, a lot of stakeholders who would weigh in on this kind of universally agreed this is a problem that we should be addressing and doing what we can. And I want to highlight one issue. I just recently noticed a couple weeks ago, months ago, the New York Times had an article about the use of non-consensual deepfake pornography in schools and how people are being bullied using this. And the headline literally called it an epidemic among teens. That was the perspective of the New York Times. So this is a a problem we need to address and address quickly. And I'm hoping that we can also, with this new technology, immediately get in front of the culture and normalize the culture around this is a terrible, rude, unethical, and now criminal, hopefully criminal thing to do to someone.
Well, I appreciate that, Charity. I think the thing about revenge porn that really does my head in is so much shame is heaped on the person who it was aimed at, like whose face may have been used or photo had been used or whatever. And yet they're not the one who broke someone's trust.
Right.
Like in a relationship, for a relationship to work, whether it's friendship or intimate, there needs to be trust. And yet no one talks about how damaging it is to break someone's trust. And yeah, it just does my head in.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing in this area is that it can happen when there isn't necessarily a trusting relationship, because all you're using is that person's face. You can find their face on, you know, their social medias or whatever, and use that, and using technology, attach that to someone else's body and make it look like it's that person doing that thing. So it's really insidious. And I always, when I give talks, people invite me to give talks and talk about data privacy. And when this comes up, I always say what you just said. Like, there is no shame in someone, you know, making a deep fake pornography, or exploitation is something that happens as well. If you share intimate images or language with someone and they share that, like, and there is no shame in being a sexual person. Like, that's what human beings are. So I want to emphasize that to listeners. There's no shame. The shame is in violating someone's trust, in breaking the law, or in doing something harmful to another person that is just plain rude. I feel like sometimes culture is helped by the idea of etiquette. So I like to also use that word. It's rude. It's just should not be done for that reason as well.
And remind us quickly, I think a lot of people may not know about Vermont's revenge porn law. Can you give us a quick overview of it?
Yeah, I mean, there was a movement to put these laws in place, which are great. And you can't, basically, you can't share intimate images that have a sexual content, and with every crime there has to be a criminal intent. So, you know, the intent to cause them harm or to harass them, intimidate, all these kinds of things. And the punishment, if you do, is if you do it to harm them in some way, it's up to 2 years and a $2,000 fine. If you do it for financial profit, it's up to 5 years and a $10,000 fine. So that's a huge component. But the other thing that I also want to emphasize, in case this should happen to anybody listening, there's also you cannot charge a fee to have this content removed from your website. So if you have a website, or somehow you are unwittingly hosting this, like, you can't say, oh, sure, I'll take down this video, you have to give me this much dollar. You can't do that. That's in the bill, or the law as well. So that's the gist of the law, and we're just amending it that little bit to make it clear that you also cannot use non-consensual deepfake pornography and think you're going to get away with that. That too is a crime.
Thank you, Charity. Before we hear from Shari, I just want to say thank you, Amelia. S-120 was passed out of the House and Senate on Friday, May 3rd. So at the time of this recording, it was last week. So thank you for that update. You know, Shari, one thing about this topic of revenge porn that comes up is that concept of shame, and that experience many people have of shame who may be the targets of something like revenge porn or sexual violence. Can you talk to us a little bit about that experience and what you've seen when you're working with survivors, and how we as a culture need to help people be great if they never felt it in the first place, but move beyond it?
I mean, this is such a vast and important topic, right? It gets right at 21st century expression of like rape culture at its roots, right? Like these harms, whether they happen to somebody physically with the actual assault or image exploitation later, all of it can have this lasting impact. It might take a minute, a couple minutes to create the deep fake porn or send the revenge porn, but absolutely the ripple impact on that survivor's life can be indefinite again, right? And that's where I appreciate, Charity, you talking about, I think where we need to look in our culture is how to get ahead of it, right? If there were a culture where when somebody has experienced this and had like, whether it was, maybe consensual sexting that happened, but was then leaked after the breakup to the whole high school, right? No shame that people are maybe engaging in that. If there's going to be, I don't know how much we learn as humans with shame anyway, right? But if there's going to be shame or accountability, it should be the person that dared do such a thing to another person. But if we could create a more compassionate, aware peer group culture that rallies around the survivor this happened to and knows, yikes, this could happen to me, this could happen to anyone, and have that be the solidarity, it could potentially, hopefully over time, take some of the sting out, take some maybe incentive out to get the laugh, or you can't take a joke, or, right? Like if we could get out ahead of it, that could be maybe some part of healing for people. I think what's so challenging, as we all know, and I mentioned this when we were sort of prepping for this some years ago, we had a column about sort of sexting and the fact that, maybe it was culturally, like, across genders, people were doing it, but the impact, if it went awry or somebody shared it, definitely played out on gendered lines, right? Mm-hmm. If somebody, that's where we still see sort of gender socialization play out, rape culture play out, the shame for young girls and women when this happens, and be just exponentially harder for anyone, I would say, right? But certainly we see it play out in that way. We've certainly seen abusers, domestic violence abusers, use, maybe formerly consensual photos or ones that people didn't even know were taken of them as blackmail to continue to have power and control over them. The list goes on, right? And I would say this column that we wrote, I was sort of joking, like I wanted to give the title, same fill in the blank, different device. But that's what we're seeing, right? It's the same kind of callousness that has always been there, but now that everybody's lives are so interconnected with media and social media, at just like one click, you can disseminate things in ways that are really hard, if not sometimes impossible, to try to retrieve, right? Actual assaults that's what's so hard now, right? It's been this exponential magnification of what an abusive person can do to a survivor. So, we certainly have our work cut out for us. I have so much compassion for especially young kids and teens. They're innocent, and this is part of their developmental years, growing up in a pressure to, whether it's engage in behaviors or be subjected to this kind of thing, and things that maybe people would know right off the bat. You wouldn't necessarily push somebody, take their clothes off and push them into the school hallway. That would feel like an obvious assault. But to do it to their image, whether it was an actual image or a fake image, and then click send, boom, right? Like the disproportion between that quick impulse to be harmful and then the lasting impact in this peer culture into that survivor is, it's vast. It's definitely part of the work that we see and continue to do.
Anything you want to add, Charity?
I would just say we keep coming back to this issue of the culture. And I think that talking about this issue, whether you are a survivor or a policymaker or someone who cares, I think is really important in changing the culture. I don't know if you had experienced what I did, where I really enjoyed this old TV show, Mad Men. Remember when Mad Men came out? And I remember older family members saying, like, I couldn't watch it because it reminded them of a time when, women's bodies didn't really belong to them in the way that we have now. Although I would say that in some places in this country, there's still an attitude that women's bodies don't really belong to them fully the way that we have that attitude here in Vermont. We're really lucky to live in a place that values that, autonomy, bodily autonomy. But I think that changing the culture is really critical, especially when, we're talking about, young people, teenagers, college students. I think you really see the cultural problems play out with those who aren't, as mature as, older than that. So the culture really does need to change, and we all are a part of making that happen.
Yeah, and I would just jump in and add too, this was a sobering statistic to me when I came across it. And the Freedom Center hosts different kinds of workshops, including bystander empowerment to help end sexual harassment in the workplace. There's lots of ways that if folks are listening and want to have some of these conversations with us and with your organization, by all means, give us a call. But this particular statistic sets up the whole conversation, right? That by age 12, 1 in 4 girls already have experienced unwanted comments or even touch in public, right? And so this sense that women's and girls' bodies in particular are kind of public property, and that public spaces are male spaces, whether that's the parking lot at the grocery store or the hallway in junior high, it follows us all the way to workplace settings, right? And then cue back to the Me Too movement. But it starts early, right? This gender divide, and can teach men and boys, right? That this is this catcalling behavior from a distance, that you can just peg somebody in this way, potentially shame them. And part of what does give me a lot of hope, though, is that because the pendulum has swung in such a vast direction, often when people are engaging in this behavior, they've never been called out on it, right? They're used to like flinging the shame and the attention, and then everybody looks at the poor maybe woman or whoever that has had their body commented on, whether like you're hot or you're not, or whatever that is. If everybody in the parking lot, or even just 1 or 2 people, just said, hey, you know what, why are you catcalling, kids here or teenagers, or, actually we don't sexually harass our coworkers here. It can actually take just a tiny comment, and they often are not used to having their sexist comfort zone even questioned at all. It can stop this behavior. Like it doesn't have to be a lot that can be said that can really shift the culture. Talk about a petri dish, right? One antidote of somebody saying, you know what, actually that behavior is not okay here, can actually do quite a bit. So, whether it's in the real 3D world or in the virtual world, there are steps we can take as compassionate bystanders, and we're certainly open to having those conversations with community members. But, clearly it's all connected and it's vast.
Something I have been sitting with, and I'm curious to hear your feedback, Charity, and your feedback, Shari, is we've made progress in so many ways in our culture, but like you said, it keeps coming back to this theme of culture. And I've been sitting a lot lately, especially in the wake of the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and then the recent Weinstein, help me, I'm forgetting my legal words.
Well, there was an appeal, and then they overturned the conviction. Yep.
Thank you. Those were the words. This idea of culture and justice system, and how our justice system is a series of laws as much as it is maybe true justice. And that balancing act of, we made progress, but now we've stepped back. But should we really be afraid of that? Because we can keep moving forward. Like, just sitting with this bucket of questions and uncertainties. And I'm curious for you, Charity, as someone who sits in the legal system and is looking at these culture changes, what are you sitting with right now as far as laws versus justice?
Well, we're all together in this, and things are always changing. So there's different technology that we've just referenced that has changed. And there's different learning, like we have learned more effective tools at prevention, at addressing the harm, and at rehabilitating the offender. And so we have changes in that arena as well. And in the thick of it, we have people, probably not here in Vermont, but there are certainly women in this country and others who committed the crime of harming or killing their abusive partner. And they are in prison because at the time when they were convicted, their defense attorney probably wisely said, don't say he abused you, because that gives you a motive to kill him. And that seems now like you would never do that. But decades ago, that was done very routinely. And so people are in prison using kind of an old, outdated law that now we think of so differently. So much has happened since in the 50 years that the Women's Freedom Center has been in existence. So much has happened and changed in all these different areas. And I think those of us who are policymakers need to keep our minds open and be flexible and act. I mean, that's why I was so eager to pass legislation that addressed non-consensual deepfake pornography, because it's like, it's here, now is the moment. You have to act, let's do something about it. And when we get new information about what's effective, we have to act. So I think just staying on it, we're so lucky that there are so many people who care about this issue in Vermont and are doing great work. And I think, just staying on top of it is a constant need, and letting our attention evolve, because everything is evolving and changing. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think that 10 years ago, Me Too didn't exist, and what a movement that was, and how it changed our thinking, and the progress I think the culture has made as a result of that, and the awareness that especially men who didn't appreciate, I mean, we all lived it, right? On social media, and men saying, holy smokes, my entire feed is Me Too, realizing the widespread impact of the rape culture in America. I think that's part of why that was so powerful, is all the people who weren't engaged in rape culture because they weren't raping people and they weren't afraid they were going to get, attacked or raped on a date or whatever. They were removed, and Me Too forced them to be involved because they couldn't look away from all of the people who were saying Me Too.
Mm-hmm.
Shari, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I want to
I'm happy to be here.
I thought I shut her off. I'm so sorry.
So, okay. I think I absolutely agree. Me Too and other sort of flashpoints of activism really have shifted the culture, right? And when we see things, that things don't happen in a linear way, whether it's Roe getting overturned or what's happened with Weinstein, et cetera, it obviously it can sit heavy, but just recognizing as a culture, and with more and more solidarity across the gender spectrum, we become more nimble, right? Every year, I would say there are more allies across the gender spectrum. And if one barrier suddenly gets put up or holds or whatever, we go sort of up, over, and around. And the Freedom Center for this particular year is using sort of a river metaphor for some, like a healing project for survivors, that healing too happens like a river current. But I would say activism, right? It isn't linear. And sometimes we lose some, or we lose Roe or whatever, and then look at the rallying that happens all around to try to see what can we shore up. That pendulum swinging, I would say. But I do see hope in the solidarity. And we want to underscore too, right? Like, anyone can be an ally here. We welcome our male allies and folks across the gender spectrum. We know the harmful behavior we talk about, domestic or sexual violence. Most men are not committing these behaviors, but the ones who are doing it over and over, right? So we welcome just the support and the continued activism of folks. And I that's what we have to do with moments like Me Too, right? What can we learn? How can we shift and be nimble, and just increase the solidarity around that? So yeah, that part does give me hope.
Thank you. Charity, anything you want to add?
I think we've covered so many great topics. I can't think of anything I need to add, but of course we could talk a lot longer about this topic, I'm sure.
And how about you? I'm so afraid I'm going to set my phone off now.
I think you mean me.
Yes, I mean you.
We can absolutely leapfrog. I mean, again, another thing that gives me hope is we think about 50 years when, you know, people were literally coming out of their homes into the streets to talk about it. And from vigils to make the news was a big deal, right? And here we are comfortably having this conversation in mainstream media, right? And then continuing a lot has happened, right? Every generation is making progress, and we hopefully hand that off. And I'll just end on one thing that gave me so much inspiration. I was at a rally that survivors created to push back on sort of an institution that wasn't responding to survivors as they wanted. And so there were parents and some teens there, and you know, there was some sharing right at the end of mostly adults. And then right at the end, a 14-year-old stepped up. And I have to say, they nailed rape culture and the righteous kind of outrage they felt at what was happening and the way that they summarized what people's rights are. I thought, wow, right? It is taking hold. This is such a wise 14-year-old. This movement has resulted in hopefully more empowered and more comfortable to speak out young humans. And that's, you know, that's our future. So that's where I would want to leave it for right now.
Well, thank you very much, Shari, who is an advocate with the Women's Freedom Center here in Windham County. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'll be linking to the Freedom Center's website and their upcoming, through there, you should be able to find some of their upcoming workshops in our show notes. And thank you, Attorney General Charity Clark, for joining us as well. And if folks go over to our podcast, you'll be able to find at the end of this episode a little bonus on our cocktail designing. But in the meantime, thank you for being here. The Montpelier Happy Hour will be on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 and rebroadcast every Wednesday morning. And of course, wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Take care, everybody. So welcome back, anyone who's listening to our fun little bonus here on the Montpelier Happy Hour, because we haven't talked cocktails in a while. So this is fun. And of course, if you've listened to past episodes, you know that Charity is like the premier cocktail designer.
Wow, I'm going to put that on my business card.
Well, you know, if the whole AG thing or lawyer thing doesn't work out.
Fun.
So just for context, listeners, I think it was last week we were prepping the show and I gave Shari and Charity the homework of coming up with a cocktail for, you know, what we'll raise our glass to when the patriarchy is no more. So I am dying to hear your thoughts, Charity.
Okay, so my concept is the smoldering ashes of the patriarchy are going to be smoky. So I want a smoky drink, like an old-fashioned, but made with Bar Hill Tomcat, which has a great smoky flavor.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have to have some like garnish. So I don't know if Shari has like a great garnish. You know, a fruit or something. But I think the smokiness of the burning ashes of the patriarchy is key.
I like it. How about you, Shari? What are you thinking?
Well, I have to say, I misunderstood the assignment and thought I was logging off for that. So I'm not typically asked this, but this is more fun than I often have, like work related here. For the garnish, I'm thinking something like, I don't know, chocolate mint or something, right? The sweetness of getting through to the other end, I would say, let the patriarchy smolder. And then the rest of us celebrate and dance, right? That would be, I know that's not quite like a recipe here. I'm more curious about the names for these cocktails.
What would you name this one?
I mean, Charity came up with the recipe. Any thoughts?
Well, I don't know if Amelia can take herself off mute, because I think Amelia had a couple of really good ideas.
Ooh, Amelia, we'd love to hear your thoughts if you can.
Okay. My wife and I were brainstorming some before this call, and just to piggyback off of Charity's old-fashioned idea, I think we could go with a newfangled as opposed to an old-fashioned.
Oh.
But another fun idea that we had was a Bloody Mary, and Mary's bloody because she's got the blood of the patriarchy on her hands.
Ouch.
Oh boy. I want to circle back to the garnish idea of my drink. What if it was a sunshiny citrus, like a candy? So it's got the sweetness because it's candy, but it's like an orange or a lemon, which is like cheerful, happy, sunshiny, because it's like going to be the future is going to be a happier, sunshinier future when the patriarchy is in smoldering ashes.
I like that.
Yeah.
I think the garnish, going back to the garnishes, I love that idea of the smoky drink with those kind of smoky undertones. And the garnish could actually be a little bit more of a little side dish.
Mm-hmm.
So that you've got it just has a little bit more of a punch
Mm-hmm.
than something candied on the rim.
What would make a good side dish?
Well, I think like a little something citrus. I like that. Maybe a little assortment of candied fruits and maybe some chocolate covered fruits.
Chocolate covered citrus. That's like Sherry's concept of like chocolate and mint. That would be this is going to be great. I can't wait to celebrate with you ladies when patriarchy is over.
Oh, yes.
Well,
or maybe a little bit sooner than that. We have a celebratory gala October 12th for anybody in Windham County. You can give our office a call. We can give you more information. But what I love about this conversation is that obviously these are really hard topics, right? And so it helps that like just the spirit of our activism does not have to be, sort of downtrodden. We're going to need that. We're going to need our humor and just that. Yeah, I'm appreciating the energy of this finale to this interview, given the topic.
So I'll share my idea quickly, and I'll need some help. I was thinking to design a mocktail because we always want to keep in mind the designated drivers and the folks who don't want to drink. And I was thinking it could be something like patriarchy. What patriarchy could be the title? But I think citrus would be great, like maybe something like a grapefruit. Something but then maybe some maple syrup to cut the bite. And what else?
Like a grapefruit spritzer, but then it needs another layer of flavor. So like grapefruit, that's hard to pair with. I don't know. This is really advanced mocktail making, Olga. I don't know if I'm up for it.
I love grapefruit. That's probably part of my problem.
I love grapefruit too. You know what actually is great with grapefruit? I don't know if this is good for a mocktail, but avocado. Have you ever had avocado and grapefruit like mixed together?
No.
Because the creaminess of the avocado and then like the sharpness of the grapefruit, mix those together, put it on a salad. It's so good. Yep.
Okay.
I'm totally out of my league here.
You could do like sliced avocado like on a in your grapefruit spritzer with like a little salt on it so you can sort of take off the avocado and
I like where you're going. Okay. I think we should aim for that. A grapefruit spritzer with a little bit of salted avocado because taking down the patriarchy is a salty activity anyways.
Oh, I love it.
That's a great note to end on.
So any cocktail designers out there, if you want to give feedback on our thoughts, if you have any thoughts on your own, you can send them to the Montpelier Happy Hour at gmail.com. AG Charity Clark, Shari from the Women's Freedom Center. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
for having us.